Welcome to episode 2 of Beowulf. Episode 2 will introduce us to Grendel, the Anglo-Saxon Cucuy. Remember, as this is a Cucuy story, the Anglo-Saxon poet will focus on revealing a value by focusing on what not to do or how not to act. Throughout this episode, as well as throughout the epic poem, there'll be a mixture of religions. As we have learned, there will be pagan ideas as well as Christian ideas throughout. During this time, the Anglo-Saxons were transitioning between pagan beliefs into Christian beliefs. The mead hall was very significant during this time. At this point in the epic poem, the good King Hrothgar has built his mead hall, Heret Hall, for his people. We learned in episode 1 that Hrothgar gives gifts and allows even the poor to enter into his mead hall. Thus, when Grendel comes into the mead hall and creates a great deal of violence, this is a desecration of the mead hall, as the mead hall is a sacred place for gathering. Through this introduction of Grendel, the Anglo-Saxon Cucuy, the Beowulf poet will utilize the biblical illusion of Cain and Abel. Remember that Cain killed his brother Abel in order to gain his wealth. Mixed in with the biblical illusions will be pagan myths. Keep an eye out for magical creatures that represent the remnants of the pagan belief system. As the poem opens in episode 2, we learn so times were pleasant for the people there. So before this episode, everybody's having a good time in Hrothgar's kingdom. The second line states, until finally one, a fiend of hell, began to work his evil in the world. We know that the his and the fiend of hell is going to be Grendel, but first, let's track the Christian belief system here. We have fiend of hell, which represents the Christian ideology or the Christian belief system. So I'm going to annotate that in the margins and label it T for tracking. The Beowulf poet continues to introduce his Cucuy by stating, Grendel was the name of this grim demon. I'm going to box in Grendel's name as we finally have learned the Cucuy's name and the description surrounds Grendel. He is the topic of this stanza. So Grendel is the name of the grim demon, haunting the marshes, marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as an outcast. So again, we're learning that Grendel has been kicked out. But not only has he been kicked out, the Beowulf poet chooses here to introduce more Christian ideology. Here's that biblical illusion we talked about at the beginning of this web tutorial. We get Cain's clan, the Creator, who is God, had outlawed and condemned as outcasts for killing of Abel. The eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain, so again, we're continuing with this biblical illusion, got no good from committing that murder because the Almighty, here's God, had made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms. So here's where we switch back and forth. All of this up here is Christian ideology. It's that biblical illusion that we were talking about before. And yet, almost right in the middle of his sentence, actually literally right in the middle, he switches to ogres and elves, evil phantoms, and then giants. All of these are those mythical creatures that represent that pagan ideology. And then once again, we switch back to this Christian ideology when we get this mention of God. Time and again, he, with the capital H, which refers to God, gave them the reward. So we'll switch once more back into this Christian ideology or belief system. As we reach the end of this stanza, it is now time to summarize what we have learned. So far, we have been introduced to Grendel, who is the Cucuy, for both Christian and pagan reasons. We know that he's a fiend of hell, and that he has been kicked out by God because he is a descendant or a family member of Cain. We also know that he's being related to ogres, elves, evil phantoms, and giants, which is that pagan ideology. So we can summarize that at the top. In order to paraphrase or place this in my own word, I've put my summary here at the top, discussing what we've talked about. I've labeled it with an S for summary. I've mentioned the biblical allusion, and I've also mentioned the pagan beliefs. Feel free to pause here to copy my summary. The next stanza opens by introducing the plot that we will see, or the major event that we will see, with Grendel attacking. The text says, "So after nightfall, Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the Ring-Danes were settled into it after their drink. And there he came upon them, a company of the best, asleep from their feasting, insensible to pain and human sorrow. Suddenly, then, the god-cursed brute was creating havoc. Greedy and grim, he grabbed 30 men from their resting places and rushed to his lair, flushed out and inflamed from the raid, blundered back with the butchered corpses." Already we're seeing some Christian ideology, God-cursed. So we can track that in the margins. Again, we know that Grendel has been cursed by God because he is a descendant of Cain. I'm also noticing a lot of violence. I've got havoc. He grabbed 30 men. He inflamed. And we've got corpses. So I'm noticing this trend, and I can track that trend for violence. That was a short stanza, so now it's time to summarize again. But there's a shift here, so I'm going to have to include two summaries. The beginning of this stanza saw a positive mood, with the Danes having a good time and drinking and eating and feasting inside their mead hall. To contrast that positive mood, the second half of this stanza includes all of this violence that shows Grendel killing the Danes. This next stanza will show us the aftermath of Grendel's attack. The text says, "Then, as dawn brightened, so the next day starts, and the day broke, Grendel's power of destruction were plain. Their wassail was over. They wept to heaven and mourned under mourning." So remember that mourn has two meanings, to be sad and mourning as in the start of day. I saw a bit of repetition that I'm going to annotate here. This "there" is repeated a couple of times. So we know they, this pronoun, refers back to the antecedent of the Danes. So "they wept to heaven" shows us a biblical allusion, and I'll mark that in the margin. The text continues, "Their mighty prince, the storied leader, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of the guard." So let's pause there for a second to clarify a couple of things. The text mentions the Danes' mighty prince. We have to think back to episode 1 to remember who their mighty prince was. This was the man who gave gifts and built Hare Hall. This is Hrothgar. Now we get this list, which totally displays him in a different way. He's no longer violent and giving gifts or kind. He's stricken, he's helpless, he's humiliated by the loss of his guard, his soldiers. He's bewildered, he doesn't know what to do. He's stunned. He stares aghast. He's disgusted and afraid at the demon's trail in deep distress. So he looks at what Grendel has done and he's sad. He was numb with grief, but got no respite, for one night later, the next night, merciless Grendel struck again with more gruesome murders. So we're switching here to Grendel's traits. So we can mark these in the margins, but you'll notice the contrast between Hrothgar and Grendel. Hrothgar is sitting staring at what has happened and is completely powerless. Grendel has all of the power, and we'll see that continued as the stanza continues. So he has these gruesome murders, he's malignant, he causes death, he never shows remorse. It was easy then to meet with a man shifting himself to a safer distance, so everyone wants to protect themselves, to bed in the bothies. But for who could he blind to the evidence of his eyes, the obviousness of that hall watcher's hate? Whoever escaped kept a wealther eye open and moved away. So anyone who sees Grendel, anyone who's awake that night, tries to stay away from Grendel and moves away. As we've reached the end of the stanza, it's now time to summarize. So what we've seen here is that Hrothgar has no power. Grendel, who continues to commit murders in Hrothgar's mead hall, has all the power. And now, because the prince cannot protect them, his men must sleep elsewhere. As you continue your annotations, the Beowulf poet will jump back and forth between Grendel and Hrothgar, who is the Lord of the Shieldings. So this is Hrothgar. The last little stanza here will come back to Grendel. Now it is your turn to wrap up episode 2 annotations. So here's what you will do. First, summarize how long Grendel rules Harrod Hall. Track the traits of a remarkable villain, because remember, this is our Anglo-Saxon Kukui story. Track Christian ideology. Summarize why Grendel could not sit on the throne, and also make sure that you summarize each stanza just as we practiced. Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.